Hello and welcome to this video. And as anyone who visits this YouTube will know, I cover a lot of jazz fusion. And I've talked about some of the greatest jazz fusion bands of all time. But there's one I haven't covered. And the reason is because I think they're so great, I haven't been able to get an angle in, of how to do it. Do you cover the whole catalogue or just the seminal albums, And that band, of course, is Brand X. Brand X, that sometimes get called the British Weather Report. I don't think that gives them the justice they deserve in terms of importance. But what's triggered this for me is the news of the sad death of John Goodsall, their guitarist, who died at the age of 68 a few days ago. John Goodsall really was one of the great fusion guitar players of all time. Anyone who's listened to Brand X, you could hear all that sort of virtuosity that emerged in the 70s, the sort of super picking of John McLaughlin, Al Di Meola. Well, John Goodsall was equal to that. He could play as great as any of those players, but he had a really interesting compositional style. So I want to talk a little bit about Brand X, but I may well come back to Brand X later on and really get into depth about them. I wasn't going to shoot this video today. When I heard the news, I thought, shall I make this video or not? And it's because I feel that Brand X is a difficult band to discuss, and I'm going to get into that, why that is, I think. And it's really, I think, to do with the perception of British jazz. That's the real problem with this, which is ironic because John Goodsall was as American as he was British, right? But I've just done a video on the Mavish Orchestra in a Mountain Flame, and as I was going through, behind me is stacked loads and loads of Brand X albums. I've just pulled a few out here, not all of them. Here we have the best of Brand X, called Extracts. Now this contains a track called Cambodia. When we look at this, is all their sort of best tracks. You've got like Don't Make Waves, Black Moon, Maybe I'll Lend You Mine Anyway, Cambodia, Hate Zone, Soho, Nuclear Born, Nightmare Patrol, all the great Brand X tracks on here. Let's look who wrote them. Well, Don't Make Waves, that's almost like a pop song, which is actually on this album here, Product. I love this album. This is the one thing I want to say about Brand X, is a lot of people have been putting up Unorthodox Behaviour, the first album, which I absolutely love, and it's one of the great fusion albums of all time. People often will say, well, this is their great album, as though they then sort of slipped, and I don't think they did. I think they went further out. I was always wanting more from Unorthodox Behaviour because I knew what they go on to do. Brand X has songs in, they've got one of the great singers of pop music, which is Phil Collins, not just one of the great drummers, but one of the great singers. So sometimes, Phil Collins will pop up, and he does on this album, on Product, he does on the opening track, Don't Make Waves, which is as catchy as any Phil Collins song. And then you realise it's not written by Phil Collins, it's written by John Goodsall. Absolutely very impressive writing. If we go through, then there's a track here called Cambodia. Now I think that's off Do They Hurt, right? Cambodia, I know there's a lot of Mavish Orchestra fans. Cambodia is like John Goodsall's tribute to the Mavish Orchestra. He really nails it. I nearly once did a video where I look at the other bands that have really been able to get to the sort of darkness and heaviness and passion of the Mavish Orchestra. So many fusion bands are trying to be like them, but very few get to that sound. Well, he does. John Goodsall, wrote a tune called Cambodia, which is incredibly. Well, it's I think it's my favourite Brand X tune. Me being a big Mavish Orchestra, it would be. But if you're a big Mavish Orchestra fan, check out that tune. He wrote Hate Zone, classic Brand X. So he wrote Soho, which is another pop song off Product. He wrote Ipanema. He was one of the writers on Nightmare Patrol. He's one of the writers on Nuclear Burn. But he's a sole writer on so many classic Brand X tunes. And I think that's something that we need to mention. You know, fantastic guitar player, fantastic writer. You know, I've only pulled out some of the albums. They're all back there. I didn't want to trail through and pull them all out. But this is perhaps my favourite Brand X album. If I was doing a ranking, I would have that there. This is so full on proggy and weird, and it's so full of humour. Brand X have got that sort of English Monty Python humour thing going on, which a lot of progressive rock bands have. They have a big dollop of prog as well in there. But the albums go from being, you know, like Unorthodox Behaviour, I think, is much more closer to fusion, right? This one is much closer to prog. You know, we have albums that, like Product, which are straddling all those areas, and you know they're really multifaceted. You know, almost from pop songs, from jazz, you know, all these different things going on. Another album I must put up is this fantastic Livestock, where you really hear them burning live. You know, what can we say about Brand X? Absolutely seminal band. So why don't they get? You know, why aren't they mentioned in the same breath of the Weather Report, right? I think Weather Report's incredible. I think they have around about 1975, starting with Tailspinning, Black Market, maybe Mysterious Traveller, but definitely Black Market, Heavy Weather. They have a run of seminal albums, absolutely brilliant. After that, they start to stumble a little bit for me. They do come back in the 80s, and there's some experimental albums in the early 70s, but there's a run in the middle which really represent their fusion period. Brand X aren't like that for me. You know, it's one incredible album after the other. When Heavy Weather comes out, Jaco Pastorius gets all these props for really, you know, reinvented bass, which he does, you know, and I'm going to do a video on Jaco. This is one of the things that is sat in the back of my mind. I need to deal with Jaco, and I know my opinion about Jaco is going to be slightly contentious, you know. But he this is one of the reasons, is that if you listen to Unorthodox Behaviour that comes out around the same time that Jaco really emerges as well into the mainstream, I believe Percy Jones is pushing that fretless bass sound equally out, as far out as Jaco is. His use of harmonics and sliding harmonics, which is really unique to him, is equally influential on bass players. You know, you hear that influence in people like Mick Karn, and I was in the 80s. I was into an indie band called Stump, and any people who've come here, you know, to hear about Brand X probably weren't expecting that band to be mentioned. But when I listen to Stump, the bass player, you know, really sounds like Percy Jones. Percy Jones has got a certain bass sound, and that's signature. And for me, that is as strong as anything Jaco did. My argument with Jaco, you know, to put it in a nutshell, is fantastic bass player, changed the shape of bass, but he really should be known as a composer. That's where he was absolutely incredible, was his vision musically. The bass was just one part of his expression, which was incredible. So, of course, we get many drummers in Brand X. Brand X are known for being Phil Collins' sort of day-off fusion band. All right. It's a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing because it brings a lot of prog fans over to fusion. So many prog fans I know will know Brand X and will listen to that like they're a prog band, you know, but might not necessarily listen to the 11th House or Return to Forever, which are equally proggy. I'd argue that Return to Forever are probably even more proggy than Brand X, but that brings that focus onto it. And even how many just straight rock and pop fans have ventured over to these albums and discovered them because of Phil Collins. That's a blessing. But I feel that Phil Collins is present. Oh, and of course, the other blessing, which I needed to say, is that we get to hear Phil really play the drums. Phil Collins is just an incredible drummer with a beautiful feel, a beautiful sound on the drums. You know, all those progressive rock drummers, right? Carl Palmer, Bill Bruford, Phil Collins, John Weathers. They have so much personality. I think this is one of the things that prog really brings to music. Is often they have more personality than some of the fusion players. There's a lot of faceless fusion drummers out there, especially now. So to be able to hear Phil Collins playing the way he plays, yeah, it's really influenced by Cobham. You can tell he's on the Brand X albums, he's trying to be like Cobham. But that's interesting too, because Brand X do have a Weather Report sound. I think they arrive at that independently, because when they come out with Unorthodox Behaviour in 1976, Weather Report have only just really pioneered that sound. Before, they sounded much more like space jazz, So Phil Collins being there is brilliant. I remember when I was a kid and I started buying the Brand X albums, and let's just fish one out here. Have we got it here? Here, this one here. One of the great Brand X albums of all time, Masks. There we go. Absolutely incredible. I wouldn't buy this one because Phil Collins wasn't on it. Chuck Berge was on it. He was absolutely brilliant. All right. I know that my interest was to hear Phil Collins playing fusion, and I think that took away a little bit from Brand X as a band in itself. On Products, it's got Phil Collins on drums, but it's also got Mike Clark, that was the drummer with the Headhunters, and it's some of his great playing, because it's more jazz rock, it's more proggy, and you get to hear that funky sound of Mike Clark, but pushed, out into a different area, so many other great drummers they had. So I think that's partly the reason why Brand X don't get mentioned like Weather Report, because in the end they're being compared to Phil Collins' other career, which is one of the biggest selling artists in the world, and it becomes a footnote. I know this personally because I spent 2 years playing for Robert Plant, and when you do that, you realise that you're never going to ever do anything else remotely near that in terms of sort of fame and notoriety and legendary status. It's like to many people, my career is piddling around in little prog bands, and then I spent 2 years playing for Robert Plant, and that's it. It becomes a footnote. Nothing else I'd ever do will ever quite compete with playing with one of the biggest acts of all time, and I think is where Brand X suffer. But the other area that Brand X suffer is they're British, right? And Britain has what I don't think has a healthy relationship with jazz, right? Britain just automatically sees itself as being inferior in the jazz world, and it compensates by telling you how great it is in this country. Outside this country, most of the legends that are propped up as being the great British jazz musicians you probably haven't heard of. So if you're an American musician, do you know Tubby Hayes or Johnny Dagworth, or Stan Tracy or Joe Harriott? Do you know those musicians? How aware are you of Courtney Pine? How aware are you of, I'm trying to even think of a modern British jazz musician that would even register on the mainstream. In terms of influence, British jazz, I would say the most important British jazz musician ever was John McLaughlin. Does anyone in Britain ever say that? No. But he's the one who recorded with Miles Davis and changed the face of music, and recorded at least 2 albums which are in the top 20 biggest selling jazz albums of all time. Another one would be David Holland, who has had his head right in the centre of music creativity in jazz for about 50 years now. But in this country, we don't tend to champion those guys. We tend to champion British jazz, and British jazz is good because it's very, very jazz, right? So when I started playing jazz, I realised very quickly that the British jazz musicians were trying to be like American jazz musicians. That was the yardstick. You know, so Tubby Hayes, who was a legend, absolute legend, he's a legend because he was like the British John Coltrane or Sonny Rollins. He was so good that he could have played with the American guys, right? And that snobbery that you have in British jazz, and I've come across it over and over again, absolutely over and over again. And this video is probably not the place to go fully into that, but I've actually had personal experiences dealing with jazz venues, dealing with jazz promoters, dealing with the jazz press, where they really look down on anything that's not proper jazz. I've talked about this as the Wynton Marsalis effect, but I think it's been in the UK jazz world. You know, so when you think in the 1950s when jazz musicians were trying to sound like New Orleans jazz musicians, and it all became very anal retentive. And I think the Tubby Hayes and Johnny Dankworths and Ronnie Scotts, who were really trying to sound like Charlie Parker, that's informed. I think the truly great British musicians, someone like Joe Harriott really is making free jazz before anybody else, before Ornette Coleman. He's pioneered another way of playing free jazz. He's also pioneered fusion between jazz and Indian music, but that seems to just wallow in obscurity. You know, he's now, you know, hailed as one of the great British jazz musicians, but at the time he wallowed in obscurity. But British jazz musicians were in there changing the face of music, and it would be people like Ginger Baker and Jack Bruce. It would be people like Brian Auger and Graham Bond. These are the jazz musicians that really created rock music, but they never get a mention, and they won't. Not in the British jazz circles, and they will not, you know, penetrate outside of Britain, you know. But musicians like John McLaughlin, Dave Holland, you know, they have gone out and influenced jazz mainstream. And I need to have a think about the handful of other jazz musicians who have managed to do that. So Brand X, they're a British jazz group. The British jazz world is not going to welcome them in. Oh, there's another one, Alan Holdsworth. There we go. There's another one, Alan Holdsworth, who lived in obscurity, that was ignored by the British jazz scene, that had to get out of England and go, you know, to America, get out there and try and make a name of himself, where no one would class him as a jazz musician because they were too snobby, because their remit of what jazz was too narrow. Right? This is what's happened, and I think Brand X especially suffer from that. You know, from being marginalised as being Phil Collins', you know, sort of day off group, and being seen as being a British jazz group that the snobby British jazz scene is going to ignore anyway, because they're playing fusion. Right, so that is, I think, the problem with Brand X. Despite that, they're still a legendary band. Despite that, you know, I'm sure there are people out here going, "Oh, how can you, you know, talk about Brand X like this?" But honestly, it's not the same league. You know, these albums were not figuring in the top 10 albums in the American Billboard chart, like Return to Forever did, like Headhunters did, like Weather Report did, and like the Mavish Dogshit did. But they were as good. Anyway, so John Goodsall, what an incredible player. Part of an incredible band. It's worth saying that he does have, and I don't know how many of you know this, but he does have that tiny mainstream influence. He is known culturally because he played the guitar on Mickey by Tony Basil. That's my, you know, bizarre fact of the day. So to mainstream audiences, if you're out there trying to explain the importance of John Goodsall, you can say, you know him, you've heard him, you know, he played guitar on Mickey. And that's because when you look at it, he's done a ton of session work and, you know, all sorts of work with so many different players over the year. Really incredible. It's sad to see him go. Phil Collins is obviously out of action as a drummer. You know, I think Percy Jones is now left holding, you know, the flag, because I think Brand X are still going. And this is why I haven't wanted to talk about, because I haven't followed their career after the initial breakup in the early 80s. But yeah, John Goodsall, incredible player. Brandek's a little band, not a little band, a fantastic band. And I know I hadn't planned this. I was going to talk about something else, but I saw the albums that I got to talk about. So this has all been off the top of my head. It's been a bit of a ramble, but I think people like that here. So yeah, Brandek's, one of the great fusion bands, and I will be coming back to some of their seminal albums, I think, later. Thank you very much. Bye.